and we'll get started here in just a couple minutes.
All right. Well, Todd, I'd say we can probably kick it off here pretty quick. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight. We always have fun with these virtual speaker series, so I think we're in for a treat. So Todd, if you just want to kind of monitor the waiting room and let people in as they arrive. But Patrick, I think we're probably good to go.
Patrick, if you want to unmute yourself, we should be good to go.
Yep. Can you hear me? Does the sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, very good. Well, I'm Patrick Byers. Professionally speaking, I'm a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. And personally speaking, I live on a farm in Webster County, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I want to thank Brent and the group there at JRBP for the invitation to speak with you tonight. And what we're going to talk about tonight is foraging. Yes, that's the title of the webinar, but we're going to focus in on fruit crops. And I see several familiar names among the attendees. And those of you who know me know that I live and breathe horticulture, and specifically I live and breathe fruit. And if you want to give me more specific, I live and breathe elderberries, but that's cool. So we're going to focus on foraging for fruit. And, perhaps at a later date, the team there at JRBP might invite me back to talk about other things. But we're going to talk about fruit tonight, and we're going to put that in the context of a float trip here in Southwest Missouri. So I think without further ado, let me bring up the presentation. All right, Todd, can we see the presentation now?
We sure can.
Okay, fabulous. Well, a little bit about myself. I grew up in Iowa and Nebraska, and spent a lot of time as a child in the water. But those were different types of streams than we have here in the Ozarks. Those were prairie rivers. They were wide, they were shallow, and they were muddy. But they had their own charms, their own attractions. And spending time in rivers like the Platte, the Raccoon, and the Des Moines River really got me excited about, first of all, being in the water, but also all of the things that are going on around the water. In fact, one of my favorite activities as a child was to hike through a piece of woods near my home. In hindsight, it wasn't that large, but as a child, it was a wondrous, amazing place. And to hike through that down to the Raccoon River. My mother would always caution us to watch out for quicksand. I don't know that I ever actually saw quicksand, but we did spend a lot of time wading and chasing tadpoles and various other life in the river and just enjoying ourselves as children. But I developed a different relationship with rivers when, as a young adult, my family moved to Southwest Missouri. And that was back in 1977. And my mom and dad had bought a farm on Terrell Branch, which flows into Finley Creek, which flows into the James River. And this was a fabulous place to be. And it wasn't long before I was going on float trips and again, realizing the charms of a clear, fast-moving Ozark stream. Well, as I developed my interest in horticulture, I tended to focus in my professional life on fruit crop possibilities for our farmers and how the fruits that can be grown in the Ozarks could be turned into profit centers. And that's obviously a very important part of my life journey. But I've also been able to take that interest into the natural world around us and to look at fruit crops and fruit plants that we have growing here as natives. And indeed, some of those have been developed as profit centers. And again, I could expound at length on crops like elderberries and persimmons and pawpaws, and I'll touch on that in passing. But we are extremely blessed here in the Ozarks to have such a wide choice of native fruits available for us just for the picking. And so let's spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about the fruits that can be found here in the course of a flow trip on an Ozark stream. So this picture was taken at the JRBP member float this past year, and this is at Hootentown looking down the James. And the reason I show this picture, certainly to brag about a grandson, but also if we look at this picture, we can see widely varied habitats. We can see, again, starting with the stream edge, and then we can see a gravel bar. We can see wooded areas on the bench just above the stream. In the background, we can see a rock face. And depending on what direction that rock face is facing, whether it's say north or east or south or west, that could be a hot, dry environment, or it could be a cool, moist environment. And then we see at the very tops of those rocks, areas where plants are growing that are likely to be hot, dry, somewhat challenging places to grow. And one of the reasons we have such a bounty of fruits is we have such a bounty of habitats along our streams. And there are fruits found in each of these habitats. And I'll try to point that out as we go through the different fruits and give you some thoughts on where you might actually find these when you're out and about on a float trip. So here are some of the fruits that we can reasonably expect to find on a float trip here in Southwest Missouri. And we'll touch on each one of these as we go through our time together tonight. And I've also expanded this to include some nuts, because obviously nuts are a very important foraged crop here in the Ozarks, and there are lots of interesting nut possibilities. And I've arranged these in order of ripening. In other words, in order of the order, that you would expect to be able to find them when you're out and about. And this kind of begins in May with strawberries and ends in late fall with things like nut crops. And so we'll start our foraging adventure with fruit in May, and we'll start with the wild strawberry. And botanically speaking, the wild strawberry is Fragaria virginiana, and it's a plant that has a very wide range, and we can find it across Missouri. I bet that I could find wild strawberry on every stream in Southwest Missouri. Now, it's a small plant. You got to kind of look for it. Much easier to find, quite frankly, when it's flowering. And these beautiful white blossoms give away its location. You'll typically find it in the cooler, moisture areas along streams. Now, one general statement I'll make about most of the fruits we're going to talk about, and most of the nuts too, is that these are plants that require sun. And so you're going to find them where there are breaks in the forest canopy, so along streams or along rock faces or along other openings that are present. And wild strawberry is no exception. I commonly find it growing on banks. And again, it likes banks that have an eastern or a northern exposure, so they're a bit cooler and a bit moister. But if you start to look for it, you will find it. The leaves come in threes. It has what's called a trifoliate leaf. And then the berries will ripen sometime typically about the 20th of May. Now, if you're expecting to go out hunting for wild strawberries and to find strawberries the size of the strawberries that farmers grow, you're going to be disappointed. These strawberries are small. They're generally about the size of your thumbnail or a little bit smaller, but my goodness, are they intensely flavored. And in fact, the wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, is one of the original parents of our cultivated strawberries. And it's lent its flavor to our cultivated strawberries. So keep an eye out for wild strawberries when you're on that float trip in May. Gooseberries are a companion to wild strawberries, and they too ripen in late May. And there are at least 2 species of gooseberries. The genus is ribes that you're likely to find in the Ozarks. They're quite frankly difficult to tell apart. That's why I grouped them together. But definitely look for these. You'll typically find them along stream banks, or occasionally you'll find them at the base of those rock faces that we saw in that earlier picture. Small to medium shrubs, very spiny. And if you're trying to, for example, scale a rock face when you're on a float trip and you come upon a spiny bush, it's likely to be a gooseberry. And when they flower in the spring, the blossoms are beautiful. You can see them in that picture. I've always likened them to a ballerina with her tutu flaring out. They look a lot like that. And then when the berries ripen, you can harvest them at any stage, even when they're quite small and green. Of course, they're going to be very tart at that stage. But if you happen to luck upon them when they're ripe, they'll be dark red or even purple. And then they'll have a sweetness to it, but that sweetness is still tempered with tartness. So this is a wonderful fruit to find, especially, you pop some into your mouth and it gives you a very refreshing, acidic burst of flavor. Now we're moving into June, and in Southwest Missouri, June is definitely an exciting time from the standpoint of fruit. And typically the first fruit that you'll find out in the the stream banks and other areas on your float trip are raspberries. And there are several raspberry species found in Missouri, but the most common one is the black raspberry, and that's the one that we see here in the picture. And you can recognize black raspberry even if you happen to be on a winter float trip. If you see an area where there's plants growing that are thorny and they have an arching growth habit like you see in that lower picture, and the stems have this kind of grayish bloom to it, you can actually rub this off with your finger, you have found a raspberry. Now, they can be confused with blackberries, but a really easy way to tell is to look at the thorniness of the plants. And raspberry, yes, have thorns. Blackberries have thorns that are, quite frankly, much more formidable. So now, we occasionally find red raspberry. It's very uncommon, though, and in many cases, if you find red raspberries growing, those are plants that have escaped from a farmstead or some other human activity along the stream. So black raspberries are more typically found as our native raspberry. Now, they have 2-year shoots, and the shoots that you're going to be picking your berries off of were the shoots that grew last year. And this is an interesting plant in that as the shoots grow in their first year, they arch over, the tip touches the ground, and it will actually root at that point. And so if you're walking along and your foot catches in a bramble and you end up falling down on your face, it's likely that you have tripped over a black raspberry. But keep an eye out for black raspberries. They're absolutely delicious. And again, this is something you're going to find sometime typically in early to mid-June. Now, another good place to find raspberries and blackberries too is in fields along streams. Frequently there are perhaps cultivated fields or even fields that have been abandoned and are transitioning back into woods, but these are prime spots to look for raspberries and blackberries. Again, raspberries and blackberries are pioneer species. They move into disturbed areas quite quickly. The reason they do that is the birds will leave their seeds behind in these areas, and they grow quickly and can actually become a dominant part of that community until trees and larger shrubs take root and eventually shade them out. And on the subject of blackberries, we have many species of blackberries found in Missouri. And in fact, it's a really confusing genus to try to separate into separate species. There's a lot of inter-specific hybridization. You have lots of plants that share characteristics of different blackberry species, but they all share a couple of things. First of all, they are biennial, like the black raspberry, and they are thorny, sometimes thorny in the extreme. And so you can break our native blackberries into 2 broad groups. We have dewberries, which grow pretty much along the ground as trailing plants, and then we have upright blackberries, which tend to make much more of an upright shrub type plant. Again, you'll find these in sunny areas along the stream. You'll oftentimes find them in old fields. And when you do find them, frequently you find lots of them. And again, this can be a wonderful, wonderful situation if you happen to have a bucket with you and you find a nice group of blackberries to harvest some blackberries. And they're delicious. They tend to be a little bit on the tart side compared to cultivated blackberries, but they make a fabulous cobbler or blackberry pie. So keep an eye out for blackberries. Now some thoughts on blueberries. And here in Missouri, we actually have at least 3 species of blueberries. 2 of them are low bush blueberries, as we see in this picture here. We'll see the Farkleberry here in a moment. But the low bush blueberry is definitely a plant that does well in cool areas. So good places to look for low bush blueberries are along the north side or the east side of a stream, especially as it makes a bend with a rock bluff up behind it. So an area that's cool and also an area that's moist. Blueberries don't tend to be plants low bush blueberries are not plants that grow well in dry spots. So you're typically going to find them in a moist northern exposure or an eastern exposure. And they are small to medium shrubs. The low bush blueberry is typically about knee high. And sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to find it amongst all the other plants growing, but if you happen to be out in April, you can look for the flowers. You can see them in the upper picture there. They look like little whitish or pinkish urns. And then the berries will ripen in June. Now, the case with the brambles and with low bush blueberries is that you are going to definitely be in competition with wildlife for these berries. These berries are a prime food source for many different types of wildlife, including birds and raccoons, possums, wild turkeys, of course, and birds too, and even larger animals like deer and bears will eat blueberries and brambles. But still, it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for them. I was really fortunate several years back to find this fabulous patch of lowbush blueberries. And you can see that handful there. It's a bit unusual to find that many at once. And I will confess, I picked those and then I ate them all immediately as one mouthful, and it was just absolutely fabulous. Now, here is an unusual blueberry. This is the Farkleberry, and it's sometimes called the tree blueberry, or botanically speaking, it's Vaccinium arboreum, which is Latin for tree blueberry. And this is a plant that you will find on the top of that rock bluff that we saw earlier. It's most of its range is east of us, but occasionally I have seen Farkleberries on bluff tops here in Southwest Missouri. And you're looking again for a tree, a shrub to a small tree. And if you happen to find it when it's flowering, the blossoms will look just like those flowers we saw on the lowbush blueberry. But I especially notice these in the fall when the leaves turn bright red, and you'll see them, they stand out like beacons on the tops of these rock bluffs. But it's a plant that is very well adapted to shallow, thin soils and hot, dry exposures. So if you happen to be on a float trip and you look up, and especially if it's in the fall and you see something red up there at the top, there's a chance it may be a Farkleberry. Make a mental note and come back and look for the berries then sometime in late June. Wild plums. This is another one of those groups of plants where there's a lot of confusion among the species. There's at least 5 species in Missouri, a lot of interspecific hybridization here as well. But as a group, they are small to medium-sized trees, and they oftentimes form thickets. These wild plums tend to sucker from their root systems. And so instead of finding just a single plant, you'll frequently find a thicket of wild plums. Now, very noticeable in the spring, they're one of the earliest of the woody plants to flower. They flower right along with serviceberry, and they have an extremely fragrant blossom. And in fact, I've identified wild plums while they're flowering by nose before I've even seen them, because it is just a lovely fragrance. And then, of course, you have the benefit of the plums themselves a little bit later. And the various plum species actually ripen over a long period of time in Missouri. And you can find the first of these towards the end of June and early July. But I have harvested wild plums as late as September and even into early October. So keep an eye out for wild plums as you're out and about. Again, you're going to be looking for them on thickets or medium to small trees. Mulberries. So Morus rubra is our native mulberry, but there are also several introduced species of mulberries that have become naturalized across Southwest Missouri. And now we're moving into plants of taller stature. It's a medium to large tree. And you frequently will find mulberries on that bench just above the river, although I have seen them up on the tops of bluffs too. Mulberries frequently grow in disturbed areas. They're one of those pioneer trees, again, because birds will leave the seeds behind. And so if you see an old home site or perhaps a field that has been abandoned that is transitioning back, oftentimes you'll find mulberries in the mix. And watch for the berries. They are absolutely delicious. And again, you have a tree here, so instead of just a few fruits, you frequently have an abundant harvest. And you'll find mulberries in late June and July. You can actually pick these by spreading a sheet under the tree and shaking the limbs when the berries are ripe. But again, a real treat. You'll again be in competition with birds for the fruit, but frequently these trees are so laden with berries that there's plenty to share. So keep your eyes out for mulberries as we move into summer. Well, then there's the elderberry, and you've already heard me express my admiration for elderberry, and I'll do it again. The elderberry is just an amazing plant. Botanically speaking, it's Sambucus nigra canadensis, and it is a plant that can be found in many different habitats as long as you have sun and as long as you have a moist soil. On float trips, I frequently see it on the bench above the river, but I have seen it growing as a pioneer plant on gravel bars, and I've seen it growing in some of the more open areas as well. But once established, it too forms a thicket by suckering. It is found across Southwest Missouri. If you start to look for it, you will find it. And a good time to look for it is when it's flowering. And elderberry flowers in early June, and the berries ripen then in July and early August. Now, this is an interesting plant. You can certainly wait till the berries are ripe and harvest those and use them for a jelly or for jam. You could cook with them. I have seen people who eat them fresh, but quite frankly, the fresh flavor is not all that exciting. But my goodness, you can make exciting things from elderberries. But the interesting thing about this plant is you can also enjoy the blossoms. Now, I know tonight we're talking about fruit, but the elderberry is one plant where you can actually forage for the flowers along with the blossoms. And the flowers can be dried to make tea. You can dip them in batter and fry them as fritters. You can also use them to flavor water. If you've got a canteen with you, just drop some elderflowers into it, and you'll admire the flavor that they impart to the water. The elderberry is a plant that has medicinal qualities as well. And so if you're fortunate enough to find a group of elderberries and they have a good crop of berries, harvest some of those berries and make some products from them and enjoy the health benefits that elderberries impart. Now, another group of native fruits that deserves more time than we have tonight is our wild grapes. And we are blessed in Missouri. Missouri is considered actually to be an worldwide point of diversity for grapes. You know, there are these places around the world where plants are found in abundance of different species, and those are called centers of diversity. Missouri is actually considered to be a center of diversity for wild grapes. And wild grapes are one of those plants that are unmistakable on flow trips. You'll see them growing along. Well, we'll see some interesting plant architectures here in a moment, but typically we think of wild grapes as vines, and you see them along the margins of streams. You see them in the tops of trees growing along that first bench above the soil. You can see them in climbing up those rock faces we talked about. You can see them climbing up cedar trees at the very tops of rock faces. So lots of different habitats where you can find wild grapes. So let's talk about a couple of these wild grapes so that not only are interesting plants, but they also give us a crop of fruit that we can enjoy. There are a number of grapes that, yes, are very interesting plants, but the berries they produce are very bitter or very tannic, and quite frankly, aren't much fun to eat, although I've tried to eat every species of grape that I found. But there are two in particular, Vitus estovolus and Vitus repestris, that have absolutely delicious berries. So again, you have the possibility of finding at least 7 different species of grapes on a flow trip. One thing to remember about wild grapes is that they have the vines come in male and female forms. And frequently you'll find just a wonderful, amazing grapevine growing, but it doesn't have any fruit on it. And the reason for that is that it's likely a male vine. Grapes are pollinated by throwing their pollen to the wind, and it blows from male vines then to the blossoms on the female vines. And the female vines, of course, produce the grapes a little bit later in the season. And grape season in Missouri is typically in August and early September. Now, the 2 species I wanted to highlight are Vitus estovolus, and this is the type of grape that you're going to find on those rock faces that I mentioned, perhaps even at the top of a rock bluff growing, you know, as a vine on cedars or some of these other trees that are adapted to the tops of these rocky bluffs. Now, several years back, I took part in a project where we were collecting cuttings from Vitus estovolus across southern Missouri. A lot of diversity in the size of the berries on these plants. And looking at that picture there, this was absolutely the best. And these berries, while they're not perhaps flavored like a table grape from California, have their own charms. They tend to be a little bit tart, but they are definitely sweet and they're definitely delicious. But again, looking at that lower picture, there's a quarter for comparison, and you can see how large the berries are on some of these types of Vitus estovolus that we found during that trip. The other grape I wanted to mention is Vitus repestris. And this is a really amazing plant. It's sometimes called the gravel bar grape. And this is a plant that can actually thrive on gravel bars. It's very deep rooted. And if you look at the picture there on the right, this is actually a picture of a gravel bar with Vitus repestris kind of clambering across it. And the lower picture shows a close-up of the plant. Again, typical grape leaves, but this is a plant that's growing on the ground, essentially as a ground cover on a gravel bar. And when you think about inhospitable environments, what could be more inhospitable than a gravel bar, where first of all, there's very little soil, and secondly, a plant is at a risk of being submerged at intervals and perhaps even pulverized in the course of a flood. Well, amazingly, Vitus repestris can grow in this setting. And I've seen situations where after a flood, I've gone back to a gravel bar where I know that there previously were Vitus repestris plants growing, and within a few weeks, you see these little green shoots poking above the accumulation of new gravel, and lo and behold, they survived and they've grown through 6 or 12 inches of gravel, and they're reestablished themselves. It's an absolutely amazing plant. Now, it's not a real prolific plant as far as producing fruit, not like Vitus aestivalis that we saw earlier, but it does produce berries that are quite tasty. And if you look at that picture at the top, I also went on a trip where we were collecting fruit from Vitus repestris across southern Missouri. And this is not the sort of posture that you associate with harvesting grapes, but that's what we were doing. We were picking grapes off of a plant on a gravel bar. This picture was actually taken not too far from Rolla. But if you start to look for it, you'll find Vitus repestris on many of our streams here in southwest Missouri. Okay, now we're working our way into some tree crops, and now we're working our way also into the fall. And the persimmon and the pawpaw are the premier fall ripening tree fruits found in the Ozarks along streams. And the persimmon typically is ripe sometime in September into early October. The pawpaw a little bit earlier than that. And we'll talk about that one in a moment. But the persimmon is, again, a tree that comes in male and female forms, like grapes come in male and female forms. So, when you find a female tree that produces persimmons at the size that I'm holding up there at the top, that is a tree to remember and a tree to cherish. And keep an eye out for these. And again, there's an abundant crop of delicious fruit on many persimmons, but it takes a bit of tasting to figure out which are the good ones. And also remember too, that when you're out foraging persimmons, the fruit needs to be dead ripe before you bite into it, because unripe persimmons have a tannin that's found in the flesh, and that tannin disappears as the fruit ripens. But if you happen to bite into an unripe fruit, that tannin will do strange and unusual things with the proteins in your saliva. And everyone needs to experience it at least once, but most of us don't want to experience it again. But when they're fully ripe, a persimmon is just a joy to eat. So keep your eye out for persimmons as we move into the fall. And then we have the pawpaw, another important tree fruit in southwest Missouri. And pawpaws are actually can be one of the dominant tree species found in that area just above the stream, that first bank of growing area above the stream. They're adapted to these lowland sites that can actually grow under the canopy of taller trees like sycamores and some of the other trees that we find along streams. And they produce a crop of fruit. And you'll notice that the fruit size, that lower left picture, can vary from very small to very large. They also vary in quality. There are some wild pawpaws that are just a fabulous flavor, sort of a mixture of banana and mango and perhaps a bit of melon thrown in, just a wonderful tropical flavor. And then there's others that taste like turpentine. So again, when you find a tree that produces good fruit, cherish that, remember where it is. You frequently will find pawpaws in groups because they too sucker from their root systems and can form actually a thicket, sizable thicket along the stream given time. Now, several other native fruits that I'll mention before we jump into nuts. These all produce berries that can be eaten or fruit that can be eaten. Quite frankly, they're not as palatable as the fruits that we've already seen, but particularly in a pinch, you can eat these. So hawthorn, serviceberry, black cherry, and hackberry. And I have pictures here of black cherry and hackberry. Black cherry, quite frankly, is bitter. And again, not all that palatable, but again, in extremity, it could be eaten. The hackberry is sweet, but there's very little flesh surrounding a very large seed, so not much to enjoy on a hackberry. Serviceberry, typically serviceberry is a scattered tree here and there, and we notice it when it flowers. It's one of the earliest trees flowering, but very challenging to find it when it's in fruit. You'll pick serviceberries again in late June, but almost inevitably, birds will get the berries before you notice the tree. Hawthorns, I'll be honest, I've never eaten a native hawthorn. I've eaten cultivated hawthorns, but I include hawthorn in this list because it is a native Ozarks tree that does have an edible berry on it. So keep an eye out for that one as well. Now let's turn our attention to the bounty of nuts found in southwest Missouri. And we'll start with the walnut and the butternut. And this is the black walnut. The black walnut is Juglans nigra. The butternut is Juglans cinerea. And you can find black walnut very commonly along streams. Again, it's another one of those tree species that we see persisting from homesteads. It's a tree that moves in quickly to open areas such as abandoned fields, and not difficult to find. On the other hand, the butternut is quite rare. In past years, this was a much more common nut-bearing tree, but unfortunately, there is a disease that is fatal to butternut. It's called butternut canker, and has unfortunately eliminated most of the native butternuts found in Southwest Missouri. So it's a real treat to find a butternut. And for example, on my parents' farm, when they moved there back in the late 70s, we had one butternut tree on the farm, but unfortunately, it succumbed to butternut canker within 5 years or so of our arrival. So I've not seen another butternut on that farm since. But if you do find a butternut, definitely cherish that tree as well. They both look similar as trees. The nuts are the giveaway. And looking over there at the left, that's a black walnut when it's green and on the tree. And then, of course, black walnuts after they've been hulled are a source of just wonderful, fabulous nut meats. On the right, we see butternuts. The nut is more elongated than the black walnut. And you can see a picture of some nuts that I found on the ground. And you can see a picture, the lower picture there of a butternut on the tree. Now, this group that I found, I had not seen butternuts probably for 15 years. And then I found a tree that had some on, and I collected all the nuts except one, which I ate just to experience the flavor, and planted the rest. But unfortunately, the squirrels dug them up and enjoyed them as well. But the butternut has a very rich, buttery flavor. It's a milder flavor than the black walnut, but again, very, very tasty when you do happen to find them. And again, I just love cracking out walnuts and pecans too. And if my daughter's on the call tonight, she could give testimony that we've been cracking a lot of pecans here recently, and I have several bags of black walnuts to crack. And it's what could be more fun on a cold day in the winter than cracking out walnuts and pecans. Hickories. We're blessed with a number of different hickory species in Missouri, but unfortunately, there's only two that really have good quality nuts. And these are the shagbark and the shellbark. The shellbark is harder to find in the Ozarks. In fact, I have to be honest, the shellbarks I have found have been in central Missouri. But the shagbark is widely distributed around Southwest Missouri. They are medium to large trees. You typically find them on the slopes above streams. Sometimes you find them on bluff tops, but typically on the slopes above streams. And just lovely, lovely trees, especially in the fall when the foliage turns just a beautiful golden yellow color. But I also like to find them when the nuts are dropping. And here's what the nuts look like. They're encased in a green husk, as you see there. And then when the nuts ripen, the husk breaks apart into segments, and the nut is then exposed in the middle. And good trees have nuts that are relatively thin and a high percentage of nut meats. There's a species of hickory called the mocker nut, which is found in the Ozarks, that has a very thick shell and not much meat in the center for all of your effort. But thankfully, the shagbark typically will have thin shelled nuts that can be cracked out, and you can enjoy the nuts inside. Now, they are more of a challenge to extract than even walnuts, but the flavor of the hickories is definitely worth the effort. And again, some shots of shagbark hickory, and very easy to identify by the bark that peels off in long, shaggy strips. And then the middle picture is shagbark in the fall with fall foliage. The pecan. Now, again, this is not a common tree along our Ozark streams, but it can be found. Typically, it's more common as we move further west and further north of the Ozarks. But if you do find it, typically it's going to be a native pecan. And you see that picture there at the top, that's a quarter for comparison. These are small nuts, but my goodness, there's wonderful flavor packed inside of those small nuts. It's a medium to large tree. It will be found on the bench above the stream or in a field area, but close to the stream, because this is definitely a bottomland tree. You can see the picture there of the nuts while they're still encased in their husks. Those husks split off in late September, open up to reveal the pecan inside, which then drops to the ground. A common nut found along Ozark streams is the hazelnut. And this is a shrub. And when you first identify it and then you start to look for it, you will find it. It frequently is growing on that area just above gravel bars. I have seen it growing on gravel bars, but it's typically growing in the area just above gravel bars, that bench above the stream. It's very much a riparian type plant. And the typical native hazelnut has a small nut. You can see the ones that I have in my hand there. Those were from plants that I planted from the Department of Conservation nursery. And it's a small nut, but boy, still worth the effort to crack open and enjoy the nut meats inside. I will caution you that blue jays absolutely love hazelnuts, and they will actually harvest them while they're still green before they're ripe. So if you do find them when you're out and about in the float, it's because they've been overlooked by blue jays. And then our final nut for tonight is the Ozark Chincopen. And this is another species that, unfortunately, there's a sad story here. And this is actually a true chestnut. It's the same genus as the American chestnut, Castania. And unfortunately, it shares susceptibility to chestnut blight with the American chestnut. Now, the American chestnut was absolutely destroyed by the chestnut blight in the early years of the 20th century. It took longer for the blight to get to the Ozarks and to strike down our Ozarks Chincopen. And you can still occasionally find Ozarks Chincopen trees, but almost invariably they are sprouts that have grown from a tree that was killed back by the blight. If you look at that picture there on the far right, that's my friend Skip Moria, who worked for the Forest Service, but she had a passion for Ozark Chincopen. And she's standing next to one of the largest Ozark Chincopen trees that she was able to identify, the largest one I've ever seen. And this particular tree, near as we could tell, was an actual seedling tree. It was not a resprout. But unfortunately, I know of several other Ozark Chincopen trees that look like this, but then at some point developed the cankers that are characteristic of chestnut blight and were killed back. The leaves look like chestnuts, as you see up there at the top. And then the nuts, as you see in the lower picture, look a lot like very small chestnuts. Now, each nut produced by Ozark Chincopen is precious. And so it was several years before I could bring myself to sacrifice a few to roast them and crack them open and enjoy them. And they are delicious. And yes, they're small. Yes, they're a bit of a challenge to handle compared to a Chinese chestnut or something like that. But the effort is definitely worth it in the flavor of the small nuts inside. And this is a favored food nut for squirrels and again for blue jays. So again, finding, first of all, an Ozark Chincopen is very special, but even more special is finding Ozark Chincopen nuts to enjoy in the fall when they ripen. Okay, so here are some resources if you are serious about foraging in the Ozarks. And the first is Jan Phillips's book, Wild Edibles of Missouri. And I am not sure if this book is still in print. You can occasionally find it at used bookstores, and it may be available online as a PDF, but it's definitely a book that you want in your library if you're interested in foraging. And Jen does a really nice job in this book of, yes, talking about the fruits that I described tonight, but talking about lots of other edibles that can be found here in the Ozarks. And then the Missouri Department of Conservation has produced a couple of guides on mushrooms. We didn't touch on mushrooms tonight, but I imagine several in the audience are interested in foraging for mushrooms as well. The first is a guide to Missouri's edible and poisonous mushrooms, and that has just recently come out. And then if you want something more comprehensive, it's Maxine Stone's Missouri's Wild Mushrooms, a guide to hunting, identifying, and most importantly, cooking the state's most common mushrooms. And this is one of the best mushroom handbooks that I have in my library, and definitely recommend it highly. And then the Missouri Department of Conservation has produced a field guide series that's available at this website that includes lots of information on our native plants that are found in Southwest Missouri. So information, for example, on things like the hickories and like other native fruits and nuts that you could find when you're out and about on an Ozarks float trip. Okay, well, that was an enjoyable romp, an enjoyable hike perhaps, or maybe just an enjoyable break from a float trip in looking for our native fruits and nuts. And I think at this point, I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and we'll see if there's any questions in the chat.
Patrick, Todd did have a question. Let's see, Todd, let me pull that up. So he said he would be curious to know if huckleberries were found in Missouri. He said he believes at one time they're found in Arkansas. I've always heard of them as more of a Western plant, but curious.
Well, okay, so yeah, okay. Where will I start? So the term huckleberry and blueberry, there's a lot of confusion among these. And, if I'm a bit of an amateur botanist, and if we look at the botany of huckleberries versus blueberries, there are definitely distinctions. And the true huckleberry is a different genus than the true blueberry. So, I mean, if you want the lowdown, the true huckleberry, the genus is Galusaceae. And you're right, the true huckleberry is found in Arkansas, but it's typically found further east. And in fact, if you want to go to sort of the place where you'll find lots of true huckleberries, it would be in the Smokies and in the Appalachian area. And when you eat a true huckleberry, you know that you're eating a huckleberry because it has large stony seeds. They crunch in your teeth. It's a lot like eating a blackberry. Now, blueberries. So true blueberries, the genus is Vaccinium, and there are true blueberries found across North America. There's probably 20 different species of true blueberries found across North America, including in the West. But what Westerners call huckleberries, in fact, are actually blueberries. They're not true huckleberries. So, that probably doesn't mean much to any of us. What we're looking for is something that's good to eat. And those Western huckleberries / blueberries are absolutely delicious.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Brent, looks like you're muted.
Saki asked, are there any fruits that would be dangerous or poisonous to eat? This was also another question I had, because this is something that commonly scares people away from harvesting wild edibles, whether it be mushrooms or fruit. So I know there's probably some, but
yeah, it is important to be able to correctly and clearly identify what you're eating. Now, obviously, that's the case with anything you forage, but it is certainly the case with fruits. Now, most of the fruits that I described tonight, there really aren't very many lookalikes that you might get things confused with. I will say the exception is elderberry. And I've had people bring lots and lots of berries to me asking if these were elderberries, and in fact they weren't. Probably the most common is poke, and pokeberries are, I don't know if you would die from eating pokeberries, but you probably would never get to that point because they're so bitter. Also, the berries on smilax or cat's claw look a lot like elderberries. And there's another plant called a devil's walking stick, very thorny plant. I think the genus is Aurelia, that has a cluster of dark berries at the top that look a lot like elderberries as well. But if you're harvesting a berry that comes in a flattened cluster from a woody shrub, the likelihood is that it's elderberry. But you're absolutely correct. You want to be able to identify clearly what you're foraging, because you don't want to make a mistake. And when we're talking about things like fruits, there are very few native fruits that would actually make you sick. There are a number of them that are quite frankly inedible because they're bitter or sour or hard or otherwise you wouldn't eat them. But thankfully, there are very few that would actually make you physically sick.
Awesome. So Denise and Brian asked about restoration efforts for the Ozark Chincopen. Have you been involved in that at all? I know there are some things going on throughout Missouri and Arkansas.
Yes, indeed. There's a group of people that are passionate about Castagna, about the American chestnut, the Allegheny Chincopen, and the Ozark Chincopen. And yes, I have been involved in Ozark Chincopen restoration efforts. And that picture that I showed you with Skip in it, that was actually a 5-year project where we were identifying native plants of Ozark Chincopen. And again, quite frankly, we just found a handful. And unfortunately, none of them were in Webster or Greene counties. They were in Berry County and McDonald County. They're further south of here. But we did find trees that were large enough to be producing nuts. And the particular part of the project that I was involved with, we were interested in seeing if we could graft Ozark Chincopen onto Chinese chestnut root systems. The idea being to grow a tree that might have some degree of resistance to chestnut blight, because chestnut blight typically strikes on the trunk of the tree. So if we could develop a tree that had a Chinese chestnut root system and a Chinese chestnut trunk and a top that was an Ozark Chincopen, that might give, there might be some possibilities there of growing an Ozark Chincopen tree, to size, and perhaps even having a tree that was resistant to blight. And we have several trees at the Southwest Research Center at Mount Vernon, Ozark Chincopen trees that have persisted for a number of years. Now, We've also had some trees that have succumbed to chestnut blight. So I don't think we've solved the issue completely, but my goodness, this is a tree that deserves efforts at preservation and restoration.
So are there any Ozark Chincopens on public lands or anywhere that people could go and view them, anywhere within an hour drive or so of Springfield? Or are they all pretty tucked away on private land?
Well, the trees that we collected from, several of them were down in national forest areas. So I don't know which division is down there in Berry County, but that was where several of the collections were made. And you're right, several of the collections were made from trees on private lands as well. And to be honest, I'm not sure where I would direct you to say you're absolutely guaranteed to find a tree. And the trees that we collected from, again, that's been about 15 years ago. And unfortunately, I've heard through the grapevine that several of those have succumbed to the blight. But if you want to find an Ozark Chincopen, your odds are improved if you head down into Berry County and McDonald County, and use that as sort of the basis of where you would look for this particular species.
Awesome. Ramsey asked if there was anywhere where he could find more information on joining local mushroom and wildflower groups.
Well, a good place to start is with the Master Naturalists. And that's a group, a joint program between Missouri Department of Conservation and University of Missouri Extension. And that group has people with all interests in it. I had the pleasure of helping coordinate the chapter there in Greene County before I was transferred to Webster County. And there are so many cool people in that chapter. And you will find kindred spirits as far as foraging, as far as native nuts or native fruits and nuts, native medicinals. You'll find people who are interested in mushrooms. Yeah, that's a great place to start. There's also a Missouri Mycological Society, and that group, of course, is focused on mushrooms, and that would be worth reaching out to as well. And there's also a Missouri Native Plants group too, and reach out to that group as well. All of them can be located on the internet.
Okay. Any other questions, guys? We've got Patrick for a couple more minutes if you guys have anything. Patrick, what office are you working out of now? How can people get a hold of you if they have something that they want to follow up with you after the program?
Yeah, so I'm located in the Webster County Extension Office. It's in Marshfield, and you can certainly find me pretty quickly with a Google search. But here at the office, our phone number is 417-859-2044.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate it. Unless anybody has any other questions, I think we can probably wrap it up. So Todd, you want to take it away and kind of talk about the next presentation we have on the lineup?
Yeah, actually, we've got a couple of really exciting presentations coming up. We're going to have a presentation in March on freshwater mussels in the Southwest Missouri Ozark area. And then in April, we're going to be looking at, that was Chris Barnhart and she is going to be giving that. And then in April, we're going to be talking about the Ozark Chincopen and the pathology lab over at MSU as well. As far as activities coming up, just a couple of things that folks are interested. We have our Adopt a Highway cleanup coming up the first Friday in March, if I remember correctly. I don't have my calendar up right now, but that's our section of Adopt a Highway on Highway M, south of Nixa, down by historic Janesville. And then we're also going to be having some macroinvertebrates coming up too in March. And we're needing volunteers for both of those events. So take a look on our Facebook page at James River Basin or our website, www.jamesriverbasin.com. And you'll find calendar events for all of those. You're welcome to contact Brent or myself and get you signed up as a volunteer. Love to have folks join us, and we'll be sending out not only the link for the recording of this program, this session, but also more information about the March and April sessions as well.
And if anybody missed it, Todd, your microphone's kind of coming in and out a little bit there, but if anybody missed it, next month is mussels, and April is going to be Ozark Hellbenders. So two really neat presentations coming up. And again, like Todd said, for event information, you can check that out on our website at jamesriverbasin.com and also on social media and through our newsletter. So I think that's it.
Thanks, Patrick. That was a great program.
My pleasure. It was great to be with you this evening.
All right, everyone. Have a good evening. We'll see you guys.
Take care.